punishments against the Chinese Communist Party put in place at that time were then maintained under Joe Biden. Joe Biden then expanded several of those, as we discussed some of them. But what we're seeing now is that the CCP, rather than pulling back, they've actually gotten more aggressive. And now it's come to the point where, for example, the CCP's economy and its ability to, prop up Russia is what's causing the war in Ukraine. The CCP, using trade, is trying to actively undermine the United States among its allies. The Chinese Communist Party is increasing its military threats. And given this, of course, the big weak point for the CCP right now is not necessarily challenging it militarily, because we're not that far yet. It's on the business side. And so given these factors, the issues that led to the tariffs to be put in place in the first place have significantly increased from when they were first introduced. And so we're very likely to watch even deeper tariffs this time around. Now, look, the Chinese Communist Party's recent incursions into the air defense zone of Alaska, that's important. Because when the CCP did that, while, of course, still trying to make friendly gestures elsewhere, trying to be the peace broker between Russia and Ukraine, making deals with the Gaza Strip factions and so on, when it made those incursions into the Alaskan air defense zone, it was giving a direct threat to the United States using what could be, nuclear-capable bombs. And these direct threats against the United States, really could impact the decisions being made right now on how much deeper, possibly, these tariffs should go. Also, look, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to dump products from excess manufacturing on markets. And this has the potential to destroy some of these markets. Remember also, the European Union is talking about tariffs and also sanctions, notably against the Chinese Communist Party. Sanctions being, of course, mostly in response to the CCP being deemed the key enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. But the tariffs also just being on the fact that because the CCP has excess manufacturing, they need to get rid of that. If they dump it onto a market, it's going to cause a price drop in the market, and it has the potential to destroy some of the local industries. And so the tariffs are necessary for the survival of some of these industries. That is the policy and the trend right now. And so the excess markets in China will also very likely be taken into consideration with this. When NATO determined that the Chinese Communist Party is the key enabler of Russia's ability to continue its war in Ukraine, that is also important. Because what's happening right now as well, the CCP has a dueling peace deal for Ukraine that opposes the U.S.-led and kind of international order peace deal for Ukraine. If Volodymyr Zelensky accepts the peace deal on the CCP's side, that means that Russia and the Chinese Communist Party get what they wanted out of this, essentially. And right now is a key time because it looks like they really want to end this war. These sanctions or tariffs or whatever they choose to do at this time, that could be one of the decisive factors that affects this. Now, like I mentioned how this relates to the, Russia and Ukraine, the key to ending the war again is not just on giving war funds to Ukraine. The U.S. has been backing Ukraine in the war. The key to ending the war right now, to disarming Russia, to bringing them to the negotiating table, is disabling the CCP's economy to the extent that the regime can no longer afford to keep the war going on its end. The CCP is the weak link, in other words, and its economy in particular, to end the war. China has become a vital partner for Russia. However, China has been accused of building up Moscow's war machine by providing critical components. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he pointed out as much in the recent interview. Watch.
What China is doing, or what some of its enterprises are doing, is to provide critical components for Russia's defense industrial base. Things like machine tools, microelectronics, and optics. Those are being used to help Russia on what's an extraordinary crash course effort to make more munitions, tanks, armored vehicles, missiles, and the actions that Russia's taking are going at a pace unlike any we've seen in its modern history, including the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And this could not be happening without the support that China's providing. We've taken action already against Chinese entities that are engaged in this. And what I made clear today is that if China won't act, we will.
Now, on this note, the timing right now is extremely important. The United States is basically in a race right now to the finish line against the Chinese Communist Party. And in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky is kind of caught in the middle of this. He's trying to get a peace deal with the U.S. and this side. He's also negotiating with the Chinese Communist Party right now to try to get them to end the war on their side. And the reason he's going to China for these talks is because the CCP, again, is the enabling factor on Russia's side. And because of this, he's going to China for talks on ending the war because he believes they can do it if they just stop supporting it. Now, Reuters stated this. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Wednesday that Kiev does not want China to act as a mediator in its 29-month-old conflict with Russia, but hoped Beijing would apply greater pressure on Moscow to end the war. Because again, their economy is what's propping it up. And that's it. Zelensky, speaking to French media outlets, also said that while Ukraine insisted on restoring its 1991 post-Soviet borders, it would consider opening talks with Russia before all of Moscow's troops were withdrawn if the conditions were right. And he said, quote, "If China wants to, it can force Russia to stop this war. I do not want China to act as a mediator. I would like it to put pressure on Russia to put an end to this war." And he said that just as the United States is applying pressure, just as the European Union is applying pressure, the more influence a country has, the greater should be its pressure on Russia. And again, look, the timing with this, the new incoming tariffs in China are important because those tariffs, rather than the CCP's terms for negotiations, the tariffs could put pressure on Russia because they could disable the parts of the Chinese economy that give it that authority and that power. Remember also, the United States seems to be very much aware of the role the CCP is playing in the war. AP said this: China has surged sales to Russia of machine tools, microelectronics, and other technology that Moscow in turn is using to produce missiles, tanks, aircraft, and other weaponry for its war against Ukraine, according to a U.S. assessment. It says that two senior Biden administration officials who discussed the sensitive findings on April 12 on the condition of anonymity said that in 2023, about 90% of Russia's microelectronics came from China, which Russia has used to make missiles, tanks, and aircraft. It states that nearly 70% of Russia's approximately $900 million in machine tool imports in the last quarter of 2023 came from China. And again, given the fact that they have identified the elements that are supporting Russia's war, those could become targets. But actually, of course, just disabling those wouldn't technically deal with the whole thing because this is trade between China and Russia, not trade between China and the United States or with Europe. If they want to actually impact this with tariffs, it's not really possible. They probably need sanctions. And the sanctions more than likely would be through the banks. They would have to go through other means to impact it or damage the CCP's economy to the extent that it could no longer sustain that support. Now, the general assessment is that the CCP is doing this for its own reasons. The Chinese Communist Party is offering a competing peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, but on the CCP's own terms. And remember, as we've discussed before on the show, the CCP's agenda right now within Europe and within the Middle East and within Asia is this whole idea of the Eurasian Empire. It's based on this idea, this strategy, that whoever dominates Eurasia dominates the world. And if the CCP can reinvigorate, the former Soviet Union and reinvigorate the Soviet influence over a lot of the Muslim world and reinvigorate the Soviet influence over a lot of the Asian region, and the CCP then unites that with new trade deals and so on, the CCP will then have that power. Ukraine is one of the big key pieces to this. And of course, that ties in with Russia's interest, but the CCP, again, inserting itself into these peace deals, has said in its own words that it wants this to be something that serves the interests of China. They have their own skin in the game. And remember also, the peace deal in the CCP's terms should be taken in context of the other actions the regime is making elsewhere, including, again, with its pushing of the Hamas side of the war in Gaza, which is very likely going to draw that war out. But by doing so is kind of galvanizing a lot of these more extremist countries on the side of the Chinese Communist Party. And with the recent Israeli airstrikes against Hamas and Hezbollah targets, including within Iran, the CCP is putting itself on the other side of that conflict against the United States and not only against Israel, but in such a way that Israel may have to go to the China if they want to have a peace deal. They want to bring an end to this. And so as that war is expanding, the CCP is putting itself in such a position that it is drawing it out while making sure that it benefits from it in the long term. Now, look, in other news, the pensions of many U.S. government employees, they're still invested in China. But that's actually right now finally starting to change. I'll be talking more about this after we come back from a quick break. The pensions of many U.S. government employees are in China. Now, that's actually finally starting to change, and this could actually be gearing up right now, not just for upcoming tariffs on the CCP, which could impact the Chinese economy, but also on projections that the Chinese economy is in serious decline. People are taking their money out. The Epoch Times said that several states are divesting their public pension funds from China amid growing public distrust of the regime in Beijing, although billions of retirement dollars remain invested in the communist nation. And notes that 42 states have at least one public pension fund invested in China or Hong Kong, which again the CCP forcibly took over. According to the Rubicon report from Future Union, a nonprofit group headed by venture capitalist Andrew King. It states 5 states, Florida, Missouri, Indiana, Kansas, and Oklahoma, are divesting at least $1.2 billion in pension funds from China. In Illinois, legislation has been introduced to divest from adversarial nations. Arizona's governor has vetoed a similar measure, and we see this now continuing as a trend. Now, we're also seeing similar moves notably with hedge funds. Reuters said, global hedge funds have trimmed their exposure to Chinese equities to the lowest in 5 years while ramping up investment in Japan, Goldman Sachs said in a note to clients. It says the retreat highlights investors' deep-seated concerns about China's economy. Chinese shares are nearly flat this year, as early gains betting a rally fizzled owing to a disappointment over policy measures to revive a flagging economy. Again, during the third plenum, the CCP was expected to announce the big plan to save the Chinese economy. They had a lot of high talk, but nothing tangible. And they also warned about, pain to come, suggesting that really for the next maybe 10 years or longer, they just expect things to get bad. But a note that selling an emerging market stock last month was led by China, with mainland A shares dominating the outflows, according to a Goldman Sachs Prime Service Team report this week. And as a result, it says hedge funds' net allocation to China, including investments in onshore and offshore Chinese equities, fell to the lowest level in 5 years, they said. But they note, in contrast, allocations to Japan climbed to 4-year highs by the end of July. Now, with this, of course, this suggests that it's not just based on strategy. It's not just based on concerns over adversarial nations, like some of these different states pulling pensions out of China are talking about. It's also just because of the basic kind of financial issues at hand and just basic, investor interests. If the hedge funds are pulling the money out of China, they're probably not doing it out of moral reasons. Usually not. They're doing it out of financial reasons. They're doing it because they think they're going to lose money if they're there. And that's based on, I think, stuff we're watching on the surface. Part of that, yes, does tie into the adversarial relationship, where the Chinese Communist Party is threatening many Western countries, many Asian countries, and, of course, also increasing a lot of these threats, including with recently flying bombers into the air defense zone of Alaska. Given that situation and the CCP's increased threats, impending tariffs, and also the talk of sanctions against the CCP, both in Europe and within the United States, the Chinese economy, based on the security element alone, could be impacted by political moves. But even aside from the political side, even when it just comes to the state of the Chinese economy itself, it does not have a clear roadmap to actually fix the problems that are currently leading to the crumbling of its economy. And investors are looking at these things. and they're pulling their money out. And notably, as they pull their money out, that is causing the problem to become worse in China. It's going to make it start spiraling. Because as it gets increasingly worse, as people pull their money out, and as the different methods it has tried to impose fail, which they have been, as that takes place, it's going to be less and less viable to have your money there. Now, there are other things as well happening. Now, we talked before about Temu and Shein, right? These are these big Chinese e-commerce websites trying to compete with Amazon, and they're doing it through a lot of kind of gray zone tactics. Using things to get around paying duties, going directly from Chinese factories to American consumers, and using a lot of kind of very odd tactics that maybe are questionably legal. Well, Temu is now facing pressure not just outside of China, but also within China. Bloomberg said that hundreds of merchants staged a rally at PDD Holdings, Inc., their offices in southern China this week, protesting what they called unfair penalties that Temu's owner, that company, is increasingly levying. And the protest was the culmination of growing frustration among merchants and third-party sellers who feel that this top-level company, PDD, is increasingly squeezing them for revenues as it embarks on a costly global expansion. It notes their complaints center on PDD's practice of withholding payments to merchants who are judged to have fallen short on customer expectations, the people said. And that includes anything from missing delivery deadlines to mismatched product listings. It says those penalties or fines have risen sharply in recent months, often without a clear explanation, they said. PDD or Temu typically either withhold payments for products already sold or levy a fine of several times the retail prices. Some say it's even 5 times what they charge, like the fine for it if there are problems. And of course that money goes in these Chinese factories. Now look, this is kind of to be expected. U.S. companies, American companies, a lot of Americans may not know this, but globally, what they're known for is good service. Things like being able to return a product just because you don't like it. That is not what's normal in most of the world. Most of the world, if you buy a product and you don't like it and you bring it back to try to return it, they're going to point you to the door and tell you to go walk through it. They're not going to give you a refund. They're not going to take it back. They're going to show you to the exit. American companies have this type of service, and American companies maintain that as kind of one of the things that make us actually pretty viable for a lot of the world. But again, that's not normal. For a country like China to try to compete with that is going to be very difficult because, you need a lot of infrastructure. You need a lot of, factories and warehouses. You need a lot of things to hold products in different areas and the ability to quickly replace things if problems come up. But the problem you have with Temu and Shein and these websites is that a lot of them go directly from factory to consumer, and notably all the way in China where the factories are. For them to just return it, you have to ship it all the way back to China, right? They cut out the middleman. That's kind of how their whole system works. And the other side, with Amazon, for example, a lot of costs on returns or contested payments, they end up actually going to the vendors. This is actually not on Amazon itself, typically. And this is also something not widely known. If, for example, you buy a product on Amazon and you want to return it or you contest the payment, a lot of times the costs are not shouldered by Amazon. The costs are shouldered by the company that sold the product using their platform. And so if, for example, you buy a computer or you buy a shirt or something like that, and it doesn't arrive, for example, maybe there were problems in shipping, maybe someone stole your package, both are issues. And you go to your bank and you contest the payment, well, you don't have to pay for it, but then the contesting of the payment goes to the seller. Now, under normal circumstances, if you buy a product from a local store in your neighborhood and you contest a payment, they can actually come after you and contest it with you. But oftentimes with these big platforms, that's very difficult. And so this type of customer service that exists, it's tied in with the banking system, it's tied in with the laws of this country, it's tied in with a lot of other infrastructure we have that allow for these types of things to happen. Customer service. China doesn't really have that. And so with Temu facing these problems now, one of the big issues is also that products are coming all the way from China. They cut the prices on shipping, by cutting out the middlemen, and then, of course, using various means to bypass different charges and shipping costs and duties and things like that. So the price on our side is kind of unrealistically low, but it also looks like they sell at a loss even despite that because they're trying to grow globally. So what happens then? If the vendors in China need to shoulder those costs here or in other countries, because there's a lot of them, when there are issues, the net really hits them hard because it's taking a company that works on a lot of gray zone tactics to cut costs and then puts all the actual costs when there are problems on the manufacturers, whenever something comes up. And that's going to be a lot of money. Well, everyone, that's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free.